Welcome, everybody, as we get ready for our talk today. Attendees are coming in.
Oh, hi, Sydney. Recognize name. Yes. The CPA. Yes. Doesn't belong to everybody else.
And over by Robert.
And do it.
Yeah, please excuse, we're working
Here's
out the
my little
kinks here.
microphone.
There, okay. Welcome and good afternoon. We are kicking off our 4th season of the Second Saturday Seminar Series.
Are we? Okay.
I am Sydney Zink. I am the brand new president of the La Plata County Historical Society. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, you might get all the applause today.
We're happy to have Robert McDaniel here with us today for the second episode in a series of talks that will be part of our program, From This Earth, the Timeless Beauty of Pueblo Pottery. Robert is a 4th generation native to Durango and founding director of the Animas Museum. Many of us, yes. Many of you might associate him with skiing, as he used to be a ski patrol at Purgatory. You've probably gotten in trouble. And he taught, and his talk, longboards and rope tows, the history of skiing in La Plata County. If in fact, you can view that on our website if you click on events and then go from there to find recorded webinars, scroll down. Some people may not know that Robert is an expert in Native American arts, including weaving and pottery. Since he retired from the museum, he's had more time to indulge his passion rather than worry about trying to preserve this old high school building. In 1990, the city of Durango donated a large collection of artifacts to the museum, which included many of the pots that were in the Indian room, quote unquote, at the old Durango Library. There are some amazing pieces, and again, we are happy to have this opportunity to work with Robert to better document and showcase this part of our collection. So this is a hybrid today, both live here in the classroom and on Zoom. So please bear with us if we have any kinks still to work out on the hybrid programs. For those of you on Zoom, we can't see you, we can't hear you, and we don't want to.
No.
At the bottom of your screen, though, if you take your mouse down there, you'll see the icons. We have disabled the chat function, but you can click on the Q&A if you have a question, and we will pick that up here and answer it at the end of the program, if we can. Let's see. We will, of course, post a copy of Robert's presentation on the website. This session is being recorded and you will receive an email in 24 hours with a link to the recording. With that, I turn it over to Robert.
All right, thank you. And thanks for the nice long introduction. Well, Sydney mentioned the collection at the Durango Public Library. And those of us that know a little history of, can you guys hear me in the back? Okay. If I get too quiet, just raise your hand and yell out and I'll try to project a little better. Anyway, before the 50s or 60s, there really was no museum in this town. So the library kind of, by accident a little bit, functioned a little bit like a museum. And people began to donate stuff there. And they had quite a collection. And in August of 1990, when I was, the director here, I got a call from the library director, Dan Brissell. They were desperately needing space at the library for books. That's what libraries are about. The museum had been going for maybe 10 years. And he had enough faith, I guess, and he saw an opportunity to get rid of all this stuff that was in this southwest room, which was a total glassed off area back in the northeast corner of the old Carnegie Library, which isn't the library anymore. We have this beautiful new library. They had quite a collection. Most specifically, there were about 25 pieces of Pueblo pottery in this collection that people had given to the library. There were also a couple of Navajo weavings and a lot of other stuff, a big doll collection and World War I uniforms, and gosh, I don't remember all what. Jan had to deal with all of that. Jan used to be the collections manager here. You came along a little later, so you had to deal with it after the fact. But with the pottery collection, the bad news was they had not documented, or if they did document, the source of the individual pots, who had donated them when, what was any provenance that they had, anything like that. None of that documentation survived, except a couple of three of the pots had an inscription on the bottom. And actually the rarest jar in that collection has a very interesting inscription, and we will deal with that jar at a later date. It's one of the coolest jars in the whole collection. So today we're focusing on the single Zia jar that came from the public library. And there, as I say, there were about a little more than 24 pieces that came from the library. And now I believe that the collection of historic Pueblo pottery, this is not to include prehistoric, but the historic collection now is more than double that. So other things have come into the collection since then. So Animas Museum has a pretty nice collection, and some of the individual pieces actually are quite rare. And the one we're talking about today being one of those. Of course, the art of Pueblo pottery dates back nearly 2,000 years. In the lower left there, that's a Tularosa black on white jar from, I think, the 12th century or something like that. And on the lower right, that's a Sityatki polychrome from the Hopi area from the 15th or 16th centuries. So even back hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, they were making gorgeous pottery. So there's a map of the Rio Grande Pueblos in New Mexico, and you see it divided up by language groups. And before I say that, let me just orient you a little bit. And I'm gonna, well, can't see my cursor very well on that white, but up in the upper left-hand corner is the Four Corners area. You kind of have a sense of where Durango would be there. You see the San Juan River coming out of Colorado, looping through New Mexico, and then up through the Four Corners into Utah. Of special note, if you can see Navajo Lake on there, that dark area of the San Juan River, there's a little tributary there that says Gobernador Canyon. That becomes important a little bit later, but I wanted to point out, that specific drainage. There are some others, Largo Canyon, Frances Canyon, and there's several others like that. Southern tributaries of the San Juan that become important in the world of Pueblo pottery, because I'll just say right now, the watershed event in early Southwest history was the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, where the Pueblos teamed up and revolted against the Spanish and basically ran them out of New Mexico. There were a number of attempts to reconquer the New Mexico province, many of which were unsuccessful, but Don Diego de Vargas led the successful reconquest in 1692. This becomes important in the world of the Pueblo people, and specifically their pottery, because with the reconquest in 1692 especially, many of the Pueblo people had to abandon their pueblos and flee to refugee sites. And one of those important refugee sites was Gobernador Canyon, south of the San Juan River. And many important pieces of early Zia pottery actually were found there, because the Zia people had left their pueblo. So you see the different language groups, the Tiwa, Taos, and Picaris, they kind of bookends of the pueblos there, and then down south, Sandia and Isleta. And I'm using all the Hispanic names, the European names, not the Indian names for those pueblos. The Tewa pueblos form a nice tight little group. Let's see, there's 6 of them there. And you see Santa Fe and Albuquerque, just to kind of help orient yourselves. And then the Caris speaking pueblos, the eastern ones being Cochiti, Santo Domingo, and San Felipe. The western ones were Zia and Santa Ana. Jemez, they spoke a different language, the Towa language. They're the only Towa speaking Pueblo left. And then the western Caris speaking people, Acoma and Laguna. And actually, Laguna was founded by refugees from Acoma as a result of the Pueblo Revolt. And then Zuni, way off over there by the Arizona border. Hopi's out of the picture. Unfortunately, no bad things intended to leave the Hopis out. And you see that name Puname Pueblos, that was a name that actually I think it had a native origin and meant people of the West, but the Spanish referred to them early on as the Puname Pueblos, Zia and Santa Ana, who have very similar antecedent pottery traditions. So Zia lies about 30 miles south of Albuquerque, and it was founded around 1300 AD. And its pottery making tradition, of course, dates back many centuries. Just a little context which helps you understand some of the changes that took place in their pottery. Zia Pueblo's population in 1540 was somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 inhabitants. And the 20,000 would include some outlier sites, basically north of Jemez Pueblo, I believe. In 1690, 10 years after the Pueblo Revolt and right before the Reconquest, less than 300 people at Zia. So that's a pretty drastic population reduction. Conflict with the Spanish military and religious authorities resulted in the near destruction of the Pueblo and the killing of some 600 Zians in 1688. By the 1890s, further conflict and disease reduced Zia's population to about 100 people. I mean, think about that. And especially in the context of the flowering of Zia pottery at that time. And even after the turn of the 20th century, many died in influenza and smallpox epidemics in the early 1900s. Zia's population rebounded in the 20th century to an estimated 400 in 1960, and by 2023, the population had grown to about 873. So despite all the turmoil, destruction, and population losses, the Zia pottery tradition has survived and thrived. One of the ways that, when Zia people are making pottery, they're not thinking, okay, I'm going to make a Puname polychrome or a San Pablo polychrome or a Trios polychrome. Their pottery styles changed over time. And then scholars looking back, you study a group of pots and you see differences over time, sculptural differences, differences in form and painted decoration, but other things too, the paste, the slips, a lot of those things. So here's a little thing that will help you understand the evolution of jar forms. And on the left is an illustration out of the Zia pottery book. And then on the right are some examples that help illustrate that. And you probably can't read those small, I didn't look at it myself to see if it's readable from back there, but upper left is San Diego polychrome circa 1680 and Jemez River polychrome from 1680 to 1700. And actually, Jan, I forgot to ask if you would, or Gay, either one, just pull that door closed a little bit, because good, thank you. That helps with some glare from the outside there. San Diego polychrome and Jemez River polychrome were the first pottery types at Zia where they didn't use a lead-based mineral paint. Several of the Pueblos used a lead-based paint that when they fired it, it got vitreous and ended up as a glaze. And oftentimes it was a really messy decoration. But when the Spanish came in, they asserted control over the mineral resources, and lead, of course, is used to make bullets. And so the Pueblo people, for that and a lot of other reasons, abandoned lead-based mineral paint and began to use other kinds of mineral paint, and ultimately mixed that with the vegetal paint, the Rocky Mountain beeweed. That jar shape upper left there is what's called in the business the Tewa jar form. From the Tewa Pueblos originated that and still use it today. Zia doesn't use that jar form any longer, basically hasn't since about 1700 or a little bit later. The next one down on the left is early Puname polychrome, circa 1700. The illustrated example there is from 1710. I'll talk a little bit more about these here in a minute, but on the bottom, late Puname polychrome, circa 1740. And then the right-hand column, San Pablo polychrome, circa 1780, and Ranchitos polychrome, circa 1800. Ranchitos was an antecedent pottery type from Santa Ana Pueblo. And before, I'm going to say about 1750, the temper material in both Zia and Santa Ana was the same. It was black basaltic temper. It was very difficult to produce because it was very hard, but they'd have to grind up pieces of lava rock to make this temper. But after about 1750, Santa Ana went to river sand as their tempering agent. So you can distinguish after that time pretty easily between those two. The middle one on the right is Trios polychrome, circa 1830. That's about the beginning year for Trios polychrome, and then the bottom one is Zia polychrome. Puname polychrome from about 1700 to 1760. And remember, this is the refugee period. This is a time when inhabitants of Zia and other pueblos went to live with the Navajos up in those southern tributaries of the San Juan, Largo Canyon, Gobernador Canyon. And you notice that both of these jars were found in Gobernador Canyon, but they have that black basaltic temper, which is absolutely diagnostic of Zia pottery. No other pueblo uses that after Santa Ana went to a sand temper. So many of the examples of that type of pottery actually came from that refugee site. Puname jars are characterized by upper slopes that are essentially straight, culminated by very short, slightly flared necks. The greatest diameter is located at a relatively low position on the jars, and the red or black arcs at the bottom of the design field help identify a Zia origin as opposed to Santa Ana, which is to say that at Santa Ana, they didn't use those arcs in the painted design like they did at Zia. The succeeding pottery type at Zia, and I don't want to get into weeds on these pottery types because there's a lot of nuance to this, but my purpose really is just to give a little context so that you can understand the jar that's in the collections here that I'll be talking about. But in the mid-1700s, Zia pottery underwent dramatic changes in form and design. And again, this is a time period when the Zia people were able to resettle in their main pueblo. The straight sides of Puname polychrome jars eventually became convex, reaching a nearly globular shape in San Pablo polychrome. Necks became straighter and slightly more pronounced, and a whole host of new design motifs emerged as well. That jar on the right is a San Pablo polychrome water jar. And won't go into all the design features too much, but that one in the lower left is actually transitional to Trios polychrome. And one of the easiest ways you can see that is that on San Pablo polychrome, the necks that were very short, but they weren't decorated. In Trios polychrome, you start to get decoration around the neck and you get a more pronounced neck. The next pottery type is Trios polychrome. And early Trios jars retain the slight bulbous shape of San Pablo polychrome, and the position of maximum diameter gradually rises. As at the other Keres villages, rims are painted black instead of red, starting around 1800. Trios design layouts are completely different from the San Pablo type. Emphasis is placed on a main design band as well as a separate design band around the neck. Zia bird motifs, as we know them today, developed in the mid-19th century. On that slide, I had found two pots to put in there that I thought were very attractive, especially that one on the upper left. And then I realized when I put the interpretive material in there that it doesn't have a separate neck design. So they're not all like that, but predominantly they were. And both of those jars, of course, have birds. Now, the jar in the lower right, usually when you have that main design band around the middle of the jar and then a separate design band on the neck, those two design areas are separated by framing lines, lines that encircle the shoulder of the jar, which that jar does not have, but you'll see that in some subsequent. So Zia polychrome succeeded Trios 1860 or so, although that transition between Trios and Zia was a little more gradual. And Zia polychrome is a pottery type that evolved from Trios polychrome about 1860 and is still being made today. The essential features of Zia polychrome involve changes in form and design from the previous Trios polychrome and even earlier jars. And in that lower left jar there, you can see that clear distinction of neck design versus mid-body design and the framing lines on both of those jars. Design styles in Zia polychrome progressed from relatively formal geometric motifs with subtle symbolic meaning to greater freedom and variety, often with naturalistic figures and more obvious literal meaning. Jar forms changed from being more rounded near the base to having more sharply rising sides, and from having a relatively low position of maximum diameter to having the greatest width at a somewhat higher shoulder. And you can really see those differences with those two jars. Design elements known as split rectangles and reflected arcs, and I put those in quotes. There've been a lot of, and I don't say a lot, a few scholars who have studied pottery and written things up over time, but probably the greatest of those was a guy named Francis Harlow, who wrote a number of books and really became probably the greatest expert on Pueblo pottery ever. And the guy was fascinating. I mean, he was a theoretical physicist at Los Alamos, but he was also an artist. And his greatest pride and joy was the Harley-Davidson motorcycle. And he was like 6 feet 8 inches tall. He's tall enough to be a basketball player. So he's quite the character. He wrote his memoirs too. Anyway, when he's analyzing design features on Pueblo pottery, he comes up with these terms. So that's why I put those terms in the quotes. I mean, they're his terms, and most people tend to use them. Anyway, these split rectangles and reflected arcs apparently arose as design motifs around 1880, then fell out of use in the 1900 to 1910 time period. That jar on the right illustrates both of those design elements. The jar on the lower left is the one here at the museum. And it's actually in a little pop-up exhibit just out here in the hall. So you may not have seen it when you came in, but you can check that out before you leave. This beautiful small Zia jar is remarkable for its form and painted decoration. With its smaller size, it may have been used by a child or adolescent to carry water or other substances. It's only 7¼ inches in diameter, so it's quite small for a water jar. Water jars can go up to almost twice that size. 13 inches is a big water jar. 14 inches is starting to get into storage jar size, but anyway, this is quite a small little water jar. It has a 4-color polychrome painted decoration consisting of black, white, red, and yellow pigments. The painted decoration also features a band of pendant arcs just below the rim, and you can barely see them. Can you see my cursor? They're moving? Okay. Because that jar was used a lot in the Pueblo, which We'll talk about that here in a minute about trying to date this jar. Anyway, it's got beautiful patina and wear patterns and things like that from having been used so much. The painted decoration also features, well, I got that band of pendant arcs and split triangular caps. It's what Harlow liked to call those things, on each of the four sides of the split rectangles. These things right here. Lines extending from the upper caps join and blossom into leaf-like elements. The red inner linings of the reflected arcs contain narrow diamonds with red circles. You can kind of see those there. Some of the design features of this jar are almost rubbed away from handling. So when you look at it out in the hall, you know, pay attention to some of the details of that painted design. A traditional red band separates the slipped and painted area from the unslipped polished bare paste on the bottom quarter of the pot, and you can see the red band in here. You know, when they put the light colored slip on the jar, I guess whether they had an uneven surface at the bottom or there were other reasons why they put red bands on there, but it was so like a trim piece in carpentry or something to mask that kind of uneven border there. And I should point out, it's fairly obvious, but the bottom of this jar is concave, and that facilitated carrying it on your head for water. You know, after a time in the 20th century, they quit making jars with concave bottoms because they weren't using them to carry water anymore. And at Zia, they finally got and they were pumping underground water or something like that. So they actually had a water supply at the Pueblo where they didn't have to go down to the river and carry it. Sculpturally, this pot is well balanced in proportion and has a relatively low position of maximum diameter. The fluted rim, a rare feature in Zia pottery, adds a certain elegance, and the patina and wear of this beautifully made jar speak to many years of loving use in the Pueblo. Dating this jar presents somewhat of a dilemma. Painted design features like the chain of alternating split rectangles and reflected arcs speak to a date as early as 1880. The low position of maximum diameter, somewhat roughly polished base, and degree of wear and patina also speak to a relatively early date, perhaps 1880s. The fluted rim, on the other hand, could suggest a somewhat later date, say around 1900. So a reasonable compromise on a date might be circa 1890. The library in 1984 had a pottery expert, a guy named Richard Howard, who worked for the National Park Service, but I think he also had a deep interest in Pueblo pottery. And I think maybe after he retired, he had a business buying and selling pottery. And he was quite the expert. The library got him to do an appraisal of the pottery that they had in the southwest room. And Howard placed the date of this pot at 1900. So here's one of the things, though, you know, with that much use and patina, you'd think it was earlier, you know, because the railroad came into the Southwest in 1880. After that time, things really changed at most of the Pueblos, especially the ones that were close to the railroad. They had access to American-made goods like water pails and dishes and things like that, to where they didn't have to make their own. And pottery more and more was made for the art market. Zia was relatively isolated from the railroad because it's, I don't know, it's probably 20 miles, 15, 20 miles west of the railroad line, which ran Nancy Bernalillo. And the other thing is, and I should have mentioned this, and maybe I can go back for a minute to that picture of the Pueblo. This, you go right by Zia Pueblo and you go to Albuquerque. You know, if you're paying attention, you can see it over there, especially going north toward Durango. But you see the Jemez River there, and you see that bridge. Before they had a bridge there, that isolated them a lot more. And I can't remember when they built the bridge, but it was fairly late. So all of that to say that Zia hung on to their pottery traditions much longer than some of the other Pueblos. You know, a lot of the other Pueblos either lost their pottery tradition altogether, or they started making a lot of kind of touristy pieces, small things, non-traditional forms like little pitchers, and at Tesuque, they made these things called rain gods. And all of those things were sort of looked down on for a long time, but now they've kind of become collectible. But Zia didn't succumb to that like a lot of the other Pueblos did. Back up here. So dating the jar becomes a little bit of a problem. If you look in the big book on Zia pottery by Francis Harlow and Dwight Landman, I don't know how many jars they have illustrated in there. I think I saw 2 or 3 that had fluted rims. So it's a very uncommon feature for Zia pottery. So that makes the Animas Museum's pot just that more rare and special. Okay, think back to the population at Zia in, what was it, 1890 or 2000 or 1900, where they only had 100 total people in the whole Pueblo. And I believe one of my sources said that the 1910 census didn't list a single person as a potter by occupation. And yet there was this group of just expert pottery makers. They made beautiful pottery, big storage jars, gorgeously painted, 4-color jars. Here's one of them, Reyes Galvan. So many of the Pueblo's greatest potters produced their best work in the early 1900s. Artists like Isabel Medina Toribio, known for much of her life just as Isabel Medina. Reyes Galvan, also known by her married name Aguilar, but I think her husband died early, so after that, she was just known as Reyes Galvan. And the best known of them all, Trinidad Medina, whose descendants are the current masters, pottery masters at Zia Pueblo, Marcellus and his wife Elizabeth, who's actually from Jemez Pueblo. So the beautiful pottery seen in this program speaks to the long and vibrant pottery making tradition at Zia. Against all odds, master potters have created and continue to create magnificent art over the span of hundreds of years. Sister Joan and I were recently in New York, and we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to see a pottery exhibit that actually originated in Santa Fe. It was a much reduced version than the one that they had at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. But I noticed a little quote, at least one of the Zia jars they had in the exhibition. The approach they took was they got people from those Pueblos to select a jar, say from the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture or the School for Advanced Research, and the Vilcek Foundation also has a collection, but they would pick a jar and then they would write, an interpretive thing about it. So I kind of copied a portion of the Ulysses Reed's little interpretive panel on one of the jars. Pottery's strength is evidenced by its permanence and presence through time. This permanence means that our stories will live on in these and other vessels. And there's a list of my sources. So I'm done. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Robert, can you speak to the interactions between Zia Pueblo, Acaba Laguna, and Zia Pueblo, and how that influenced pottery design?
Good question. Yeah, and of course, Zia speaks a similar language to Acoma Laguna. It's a question of dialect, and I understand that they're not always that mutually intelligible, but there was an awful lot of design sharing and that sort of thing, interaction between the Zians and the people at Acoma and Laguna, and Zuni too. Let me go back to
I just think of some of the individual designs, the Zuni heartline gear, which appears in Zia, and the Acoma Laguna, and the rainbow shape also appear in Zia. So
right.
it would seem to me that there's been some interaction early on since some of those pots
Oh,
in
yeah.
1750 with those designs.
Absolutely, there was. And one of the, kind of common designs that you'll see both at Zuni and Zia is that volute, or it's almost like a spiral, but very common in Zia pottery, but it's also very common in Zuni pottery. And I think it probably more originated in Zuni, and the Zias picked it up. You also see it at Acoma Pueblo. And the birds, I didn't talk too much about birds, which are a very common design motif at Zia, but also at Acoma, maybe to a lesser extent at Zuni. Zuni's birds were kind of minor in the design scheme of things, but birds at Zia, more realistic birds, not abstract birds, but they started appearing on Zia pottery about 1850. And for first, 20 or 30 years, something like that, their birds were like parrots, much like the Acoma parrots. But later on, not so much parrots, more what people have called roadrunners. And, now that jar in the upper left there, that's an early pot. I mean, relatively early, and that's more like a parrot. But the birds that you see on Reyes Galvan's pot are more like what we think of as Zia birds, more like, and I don't even think they look that much like roadrunners, but that's what people call them. So a lot of interchange of ideas, especially among those pueblos that you mentioned, but also even some of the Tewa pueblos. Joni?
My question was about the interaction,
Oh,
how.
you guys are on the same wavelength then. Judy?
That we keep seeing these bisected rectangles and what's the other symbol?
Reflected arcs.
What meaning comes out of those? Maybe
I don't know. There is a lot of symbolism in painted designs of Pueblo pottery. White people aren't privy to all of those things. And honestly, Harlow makes the point in his Zia book that, modern Zia people don't even necessarily understand what meaning was intended or symbolism was intended from ancestral types. Yes, sir.
The Zia symbol originated with Zia Pueblo, and
Let's,
How about any of the one,
let's say that again, Ed.
the Zia symbol,
Oh,
we used to see it in Mexico. It originated with the Zia Pueblo, and is it originated in their park?
it's definitely in their pottery. I have a pot at home by Marcellus and Elizabeth Medina that has the Zia symbol on it, and there are earlier ones too. And I believe it did originate at Zia Pueblo. Should have looked that one up.
Well, Robert, if you went down and watched the Zia people making their pottery today, they still use the same methods. Pan it, make it, they don't use pottery wheels, they don't use.
Yeah, you know, I didn't talk at all about construction of pots like that, but yes, basically it's the same process. They're using the same clays and tempers and for the most part paints. The biggest difference, I would say, at a lot of the pueblos is that they are firing them in kilns now instead of outdoors. You know, firing outdoors is tricky at best. You know, it's difficult to control the fire. It's difficult to control the temperature. You get wind, something like that, that can really mess things up. And you can spend a lot of time creating a beautiful pot and then it cracks and breaks in the firing. So with a kiln, you know, you can precisely control the temperature at which it's fired. That's the biggest thing. Now in the 20th century, mid 20th century, and I don't know if Rafael Medina pioneered this. There may have been other people who did it, but he actually used acrylic paints that were applied as for the decoration after the pot was fired. You know, traditionally you would slip and paint the decoration on there and then fire the pot. But there are pots, and Marcellus, his son, also did that, but I don't think he does it anymore. So there are some pots out there from especially mid 20th century that have those acrylic paints that are post-fired pigments. Yeah. Another question.
I'm just curious about the logistics of getting the pot from the library to the museum, not the, was it? What did the museum have to do to receive the pot, and did the pot come with any kind of
Record.
yeah, thank you, all of you're here. And did the museum board have to vote on it, or I'm just curious how, and you just some guy in a pickup drove it over and waited out?
No, we went and picked all the stuff up. So we packed the pots so that, you know, in boxes and things so they wouldn't get broken in transit. The process of accessioning pieces like that, which means to bring them into the collections, is normally that we get a deed of gift. If somebody gives something to the museum, they sign a deed of gift form conveying without any conditions that item or items to the museum. That was a little bit of a tricky case because, you know, the library basically, certainly the building, belonged to the city. You know, the city and county cooperate on the operation of the library, or at least the funding of it. But what we did was we got the city manager to sign the deed of gift. So that's the process. Now, you know, normally in museums like this, the board doesn't vote on every accession. What is much more common practice now, and we didn't really do it in the early years here, is that you have a collections committee. So that if you take something in, you, you do a temporary receipt, then your collections committee considers it with a lot of things in mind. You know, is it a duplicate of something else you already have? Is it a duplicate, but it's a better example, or it's got better provenance? I mean, there's a lot of issues like that that they look at. If you want to talk about, you know, prehistoric pottery, like, or Navajo pots, where they were illegally taken off of public land, and that triggers NAGPRA considerations, and just ethical and moral issues like that, that a collections committee would consider before you would formally accept it. Long story short. And this museum now has a collections committee, I think. Center of Southwest Studies definitely does. Gay is telling me, yes, they do. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Did I answer your question, Bill, adequately? Okay.
Are they all from the books that you referenced?
Some of them are from the book, from the Zia Pottery book. Actually, they're from either of at least two books. Can't remember. A lot of the images, honestly, I got off the internet too, or some of them. Some of them are pots that I either own or used to own. So kind of a variety of places. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Van Gogh ended up with 25 pots here, and it's really great.
Yeah. About
Are all 25 still present in the museum's collection, or is it just that singular one?
Oh, no, they're all here. Once you accession something, deaccessioning it can be a problem. You know, we don't, that's a whole nother topic for another time. Bad museum practices, and there are many examples of very reputable top drawer museums who have sold things and continue to sell things out of their collections. I don't think we've ever done that. Anyway, your collections policy addresses how you deaccession things, but we haven't, to my knowledge, deaccessioned any pottery. There was something else about your question that I didn't answer.
Are they all on display?
No, some of them are. And Susan Jones is upstairs coordinating the Zoom presentation, and maybe some of the other board members could speak to this, but they got some grant money to fabricate or to get some display cases that are in use up there. In fact, what we used to call the Indian Room now has quite a few of the pots in the collections here on exhibit, but they're not all on exhibit at the same time. You know, they may rotate in and out, and but you should go upstairs and check that out. I haven't seen it lately, but the last time I looked, at least half of the pots on exhibit are prehistoric, and maybe the other half historic pieces, but they're kind of rotating them a little bit. So, you know, no good museum can display everything all at the same time. You'd have the place wallpapered with pictures and stuff like that. And I mean, there are tens of thousands of objects here, believe it or not. So, you know, you just have to, plus it's just not good conservation to have things out all the time exposed to light and things like that. So,
And some of the pots like this one are historic, others are mid-20th century tourist wear that really aren't that
yeah,
interesting.
right. I know I was thinking about, you know, if we keep on with this series, which I'm sure we'll do, will we ever feature, you know, the tourist pieces? Maybe. we don't have any rain gods or more interesting things. We just have some little Tsuke pictures that are painted with post-fired pigments, a little watercolor or something added to them. They're not spectacular like some of the other pieces are. Yeah. All in, all done?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all again for joining us. A little bit of shameless self-promotion, in case you forget, we're open 10 to 4 on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and from 1 to 4 on Wednesday and Friday.
All right, so for those of you still hanging in there with us, that was an amazing presentation that Robert gave to us on this pot. We're going to kind of slowly break it down. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Again, if you do have questions, either type them in the Q&A real quick, or you can always send them to info@animusmuseum.org, and we'll get in touch with Robert and get your questions answered. But I think there were some great questions in the classroom there today. Let's see, the museum is open to the public Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays from 10 to 4, and Wednesday and Friday from 1 to 4. Our biggest challenge has been the snow right now. If the streets are bad, we will not open to keep our staff and our volunteers safe. We have been posting delayed openings or closing on our Facebook and Instagram pages, so definitely check there. I guess you could say if the schools are closed, we're probably going to be closed as well. Next up, February 10th, which happens to be the second Saturday of the month for next month, is the 150th anniversary of the founding of La Plata County. That happened in 1874, and we're going to be commemorating it with a pop-up exhibit opening in the lobby of the museum that day. We'll have coffee and donuts if you're in town, and a talk on Zoom and live, and we'll have all the details probably at the same time. We'll have more of the details coming out in a little bit on our website. We'll hope you'll join us. This is one of the first of our events to commemorate the 150 years of Colorado statehood and 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. We've got all these events happening leading up to 2026, so this will be kind of one of the first. Again, check our website and our social media and e-blasts, and we'll have more information as we get closer. But to keep up with us, join us. Members only get access to our online catalog database, and you can sign up on our website, animusmuseum.org. You can visit our website for plenty of resources, including all of the recorded videos over the years. Subscribe to our e-blast, follow us on Facebook, like us on Instagram. And if you would like to see continued programming like this, be sure to hit the donate button on the website, or hit the support page and you can donate there as well through either PayPal or through Colorado Gives. So if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all again. Everybody have a great weekend. Thanks again.